Ms. Ron.
Good morning, my lady. My lady, may I call the next witness, Dr. Sarah Hughes?
I do solemnly,
solemnly,
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming to help us, Dr. Hughes.
Thank you.
Doctor, could you give us your full name, please?
Yes, Sarah Joan Hughes.
Thank you. Dr. Hughes, you should have in front of you a copy of a statement with the reference INQ 000652569.
Yes.
Can you confirm that is a statement that you have provided for the purposes of the inquiry?
Yes, I can.
And can you confirm that any facts stated within the statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Dr. Hughes, turning first to your professional background, in summary, and I'm taking this from paragraph 1 of your statement, you are the Chief Executive Officer of Mind, the mental health charity?
That's right.
And it's right that you've been in that role since January 2023?
Indeed.
But you also have over 30 years of experience in mental health and social care.
I have, yes.
Although you weren't employed by Mind at the relevant time, January 2020 to June 2022, is it right that in your previous role as Chief Executive of the Centre for Mental Health, you were actively involved in the response to the pandemic?
Yes, that's the case.
Now, Dr. Hughes, you've set out the very many activities of Mind within your statement at paragraphs 6 to 11. In summary, it's the largest mental health charity in England and Wales.
Yes.
And your mission is to give high-quality information and support to people experiencing mental health problems?
Absolutely.
And you deliver that, and again, I'm summarising, through a variety of frontline services, information and advice, policy influencing,
Yes.
public campaigns, and intervening in legal cases. Is that right?
That's true, yes.
And the legal cases that you might intervene in, they're ones where there's potential to improve the law for people with mental health problems. Is that correct?
It is.
Now, that's just a summary. What I really want to ask you about is the work that Mind was doing during the pandemic. In broad terms, the demand increased substantially during the pandemic. Is that correct?
It absolutely is, and thank you very much for having Mind at the COVID inquiry. It's incredibly important to tell the mental health story. So, absolutely, overnight, demand for services increased dramatically, both in terms of the community services that our local Minds provide, but also in terms of the online provision that we provide centrally, including information services and our online peer support platform.
Were you quite well prepared for that transition yourself at Mind? Is it something you were already doing, or did you have to rapidly get on board with providing these sorts of services?
Well, it was a mixed picture. We were able to ramp up our online services quite quickly because we already had the setup. Our local Minds were also able to ramp up delivery quite quickly and transfer services to remote delivery. But that did take a bit of time. But I absolutely recollect a rapid turnaround in many instances, including our own ability to increase our helpline provision.
Thank you. Now, I don't need to take you to it, but you've also been provided with parts of statements from other providers, such as the Association of Mental Health Providers. I believe Mind's a part of that association, is that correct?
Yes, we are.
You say that. And they also refer to services, crisis lines, hotlines. Is that consistent with what you've been describing?
Absolutely. Every single aspect of the mental health system experienced a surge right away. So this included Shout, the services that are provided online for children, young people. They experienced significant surges right away. We experienced lots of our community services, people who'd never used mental health services before pitching up for support and distress.
That's interesting in terms of people not having rung a hotline before. You asked, again, I don't need to take you forward, but it's at paragraph 98.1. You asked local mind groups who were responsible for delivering your services across the country, you asked them for their insights about why they thought or what they remembered about this increase. And what they described is people being anxious and depressed due to lockdown, and also what they were seeing reported in the media. Is that does that accord with your recollection?
Absolutely. One of the most astonishing factors that we saw, especially for children and young people, the impact of the rolling news, the constant noise about what was happening, that kind of sense of crisis and emergency. So every time, for instance, there was an announcement by a minister, a specific kind of moment in time, all of the helplines would experience a significant spike in contact with people who were deeply anxious about what it meant for them, how long this would go on for, and indeed shouts can reflect that quite candidly in terms of announcements made by prime ministers in relation to the pandemic.
I think Shout is at a young person's hotline. I should just remind you that Modulate has dealt with young people. It's really interesting to hear it again, but it wasn't just young people. It was adults as well who were calling, of course. Now, what local minds have described is the access to community mental health services being reduced, and essentially charities like Minds in some ways filling the gaps. Is that a fair sort of description of what you felt that you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we understood at the time was that statutory services quickly closed down. So both services run by local authorities and the NHS quickly disappeared. So we saw a rapid decline in our service users' ability to continue with any level of support. So, and this is not an attack on the NHS or local authorities, because absolutely we understand the circumstances they were in. Nonetheless, our local minds had to step into that gap. And so instances where service users were shielding or they were unable to access support for serious mental illness, our services stepped in either remotely or by providing kind of safely distanced support.
Doctor, I am reminded, and this is probably for me as well as you, that we need to speak slowly because we've got a stenographer who's trying to get down what we're saying. What you're saying is really interesting, and I think people tend to speak a bit faster when we're having a conversation. I'm in North London too,
so it definitely is very fast. I'll slow down.
Let's both slow down, and let's take it a little bit slower now in terms of the next few questions. You've talked about community mental health services not being as accessible, Mind trying to fill the gap, but clearly they couldn't entirely fill the gap. And you say at paragraph 93 of your statement that in particular the people who had pre-existing physical and mental health conditions, they were requiring more support, but some reported, despite that, feeling a sense of unsupportedness during the pandemic. Is that correct?
Of course. I mean, it absolutely is correct. So local mind services primarily are dealing with people's mental health challenges. But we do also accept that many of our service users will have coexisting conditions, mainly, lung, heart, ability to kind of get around, etc. So we absolutely know that that's the cohort that we're working with, and our services usually are able to adapt and accommodate. But that wasn't the case generally across the system. So of course, if you were a shielding individual, it would be very difficult for you to access services. So you might be able to access some online resource, but being able to go and see your GP or being able to access a community group, etc., became impossible. And so for people with health conditions, physical disabilities, there was an additional layer of structural barriers that they had to experience. It wasn't just they couldn't access, but actually we couldn't get to them.
Yep. Thank you. Now, in terms of specific types of mind services where there was an increased demand, at paragraph 14, you say that in particular, bereavement support and suicide prevention services saw unprecedented demand. Is that correct?
It is.
And just on that point, we heard some expert evidence yesterday that suggested they hadn't established any clear evidence of increased suicides. But the expert thought that that cohort, people with severe illness, would be at increased risk. Does that fit with your experience of demand?
It does. So what we saw is an increase in people with suicidal ideation. So we expanded our emotional support helpline for that reason, because people were coming to us with ever-increasing complexity, ever-increasing levels of acuity in terms of their distress. So in terms of worries about suicidality, at that time, everybody was very, very concerned. And so we ensured that our suicide prevention services across the piece expanded as much as they could. And in fact, we had some support from local authorities to do that. In terms of bereavement services, it's also the case. Obviously, people started to lose individuals really quickly. And certainly from a mental health perspective, this brought people who'd never accessed mental health services to us before. And so immediately we had to spring to life some quite significant surge plans to respond to that demand.
Thank you. And I'll come back to that at the end of your evidence, specifically bereavement support. Dr. Hughes, I now want to move on to a number of reports that Mind produced during the pandemic, which you have exhibited to your statement. Is it correct that in June 2020 you produced 2 reports, one for England and one for Wales, entitled The Mental Health Emergency: How has the coronavirus pandemic affected our mental health?
Yes.
And then a follow-up or a further report in June 2021, and that was for both England and Wales. And is it right that that then considered the ongoing impact of the pandemic on people with mental health problems?
Yes.
And my lady, could I please adduce those reports? The inquiry numbers are INQ 000 471 282, INQ 000 649 007, and INQ 000 471 299.
Certainly.
Dr. Hughes, I'll pick up just a few of the main points, but would it be right to say that, broadly speaking, the picture painted was similar between England and Wales?
Yes.
And so if we could just get the essential learnings from the first report up on the slide, please. INQ 000 471 282 at page 5. That's the front cover. And if I could ask for page 5 to go up with the essential learnings. Yeah, so we have there in the box the essential learnings from this report, which marries with the Welsh report. And essentially, it's elsewhere in the report explained that these came from a survey that included responses from 14,421 adults aged 21 plus. Is that correct? And looking at the slide, it's right to say that more than half of them said that their mental health had got worse.
Absolutely.
And the main drivers for that were the restrictions on seeing people, going outside, health worries, and loneliness. Now, the slide also refers to something we've already heard about from our expert witnesses, and that is a reduction in health seeking because people didn't think that they deserved support, self-stigma as it is. Could you expand a little on your recollection of this feature of people's response to the pandemic?
Yes, it was quite an extraordinary response, actually. We found lots of people who just thought, you know, there are people dying out there from COVID. My needs do not compare. My needs are, absolutely at the kind of bottom end of the scale. And so people were not seeking help, even under the most extraordinary circumstances, even when they were in crisis, even when they felt suicidal. So often they might phone a helpline, but actually in some instances people needed to be treated by a clinical team. They needed to go to A&E, but they wouldn't do that, and they would suffer for long periods of time at home on their own.
Do you think that's part of essentially a prioritisation of physical health concerns as compared to mental health concerns? In other words, if it's something to do with feeling anxious or depressed, that's not worthy of attention because there's nothing physically wrong with you. Is that part of what we've heard?
Absolutely. We in the mental health field for decades have really understood a lack of parity of esteem. Physical and mental health are still seen as competing realities as opposed to one experience that all of us have and kind of, manage on a day-to-day basis. We very much saw during the pandemic, if you think about all of the messaging that came out, it was all about staying physically well. It was all about, the dramatic scenes at the hospital, people waiting to get help, people on life support machines and so on and so forth. So if you can imagine having a mental health problem, you're just feeling like you can't compare and that there's no one there for you. So there were no mental health discussions or, moments for people to say, look, okay, if you're in trouble, this is where you need to go. That just didn't happen. And so we were flooded with these images of very busy A&E departments and wards and a constant conversation about the physicality of all this, which on one level we understood, but equally for our beneficiaries, it was another moment in time where the message felt like you're less important.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. That's very helpful. It isn't just a case of people not wanting to seek help. A quarter of respondents said they had actually tried and failed to get support.
That's right.
Now, we've already heard expert evidence about the disruption of health services during the pandemic and the impact of that. But from Mind's perspective, you were also hearing what you've summarised there, that disruption of services was impacting on people's ability to get help at an early stage?
It was astonishing, actually. One of the things that we saw very, very quickly was our ability to prevent crisis disappeared overnight. And so any opportunity we had to intervene at those early stages, so when people were at that point coming to help, get help or seek support from their GP or pop along to a local Mind or another mental health service, that bit of the puzzle disappeared, and so our ability to intervene earlier slipped away. And so in the end, people were getting into crisis. At that point, we might be able to intervene, but not always.
Yes. So we have heard quite a bit about the adverse effect, both in terms of the individual and services on not getting help in time and presenting when you're essentially in crisis.
Absolutely.
One particular issue that has been discussed a great deal is the new remote services, and we've discussed Mind's own experience of that, getting up to speed quite quickly. We've heard from experts about how that didn't suit anyone or everyone that needed care. Again, Mind did a lot of work on this, as I understand it, during the pandemic. And at paragraph 20.6 of your statement, you say that you, at the outset, were seeing vulnerable people struggling to book doctor's appointments and access medication. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, this was the moment that really brought the digital divide to the surface. It was something that we absolutely knew existed before the pandemic, but absolutely accelerated during. And so we saw people not in a position to book appointments, not in a position to have a remote conversation with a practitioner, either because they didn't have the resources it could have been that they didn't have the skills. Some people didn't have the capacity. So if you're living with a very serious mental illness, maybe psychosis, managing all of that technology during moments of stress and crisis would be incredibly difficult and fraught. And indeed, people often were in vulnerable scenarios. So seeking, if you're living in a home with 3 other people, finding a confidential space to have a remote consultation became very challenging as well. Equally, it made it very difficult for practitioners to kind of really discern what was going on for the individual, because you're only seeing them in a snapshot in time. You can't really understand what's going on for them. And so many tells, if you like, were missed and lost.
The tells don't come through the screen, is
No.
that what you're saying?
Yeah.
That I can quite understand that. You've said in your statement that your concern was really about choice. You've got a report, I'm not going to take you to it, trying to connect the importance of choice in remote health services. Is that what you really saw during the pandemic, that people weren't being given a choice and it was impacting upon them?
Oh yes, there wasn't a choice, and there wasn't an opportunity to really think about what could be done as an alternative to remote consultations. So for a very long time, people had either they could do that or they couldn't. They might be able to access, kind of community support via local minds or other mental health organisations. That was light touch. But in terms of, support for clinical needs, there wasn't a choice. And actually we heard from practitioners too that they found not being able to offer choices to their patients who they knew were incredibly vulnerable created some moral injury in the long term. So actually it had the impact was felt all round. It wasn't just on people receiving the services, but also delivering them.
Yes, Dr. Hughes, I will come back to that term you've used there in a moment, moral injury. It's an interesting term that you've used in your statement, and I will ask you about it. Finally, on this topic of remote health services, you do say, for instance, at paragraph 169.4 of your statement, you did see positives, older service users becoming more engaged with technology by necessity, I take it.
Absolutely. And of course, we supported across our local minds, we supported the education of digital skills. So we supported lots of groups who were vulnerable in different ways to develop some understanding about how they could use technology in their care. We continue to do that across the piece because, as we know, remote consultations and the way in which we deliver services hasn't gone back to pre-pandemic times. So this is still an ongoing legacy of the pandemic.
Yeah, and a positive one.
And a positive one, yes.
Looking back to the slide on coping mechanisms, what you've said there is connecting with family and friends online was the most popular way to cope. This is from 2020 amongst both young people and adults. No surprise particularly there. But just to flag the remainder of coping strategies, when you look at the detail of what you're describing there, are essentially harmful behaviours, it seems.
Absolutely, yes.
So within the report, it's highlighted that there are vulnerable groups tying in with that first bullet point there with eating disorders who are over or under eating to cope, perhaps not even people with diagnoses of eating disorders. That seems to be a feature. Obsessive compulsive disorder is flagged in the report, and those with experiencing social deprivation were particularly impacted. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Again, one of the things that was very clear, again, very, very quickly, is that coping mechanisms varied, and some were positive. So we had people use physical activity, they use their hour a day to really kind of support their well-being. But equally, we also saw an increase in the use of alcohol, drugs, self-harm. For people with eating distress, it became almost impossible to be in a kind of confined space, often, with parents or with loved ones, and kind of that pressure around eating. So it became like a sort of, it was like a nuclear, just about, waiting to happen. It was such a tinder spike. It was, if you can imagine somebody at home with eating distress or feelings of, mental illness, being surrounded by individuals. Often we don't always understand what's going on for people. So the pressure was extraordinary. And so sadly, people did retreat to coping mechanisms that were incredibly unhealthy. And of course, people who already used alcohol or drugs, for instance, to support, or to manage their mental health or their difficult feelings, also couldn't access AA support or any of those sorts of things that they might have done before the pandemic, because they also disappeared until they re-emerged online. And again, some of those worked and some of those didn't. So for all of the coping mechanisms that were very negative, all of the mitigants disappeared.
Yes.
So sadly, again, we couldn't intervene early enough in some of those situations.
Thank you. Doctor, you do come back to those 3 reports that I have adduced and its findings in more detail at the end of your statement, and that's there, obviously, for everybody to read. But briefly on the second report from July 2021, is it correct that that confirmed many of the same issues still pertained at that point?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we continue to see a decline in people's mental health. We also continue to see a surge in demand that we couldn't meet. We also saw a continuation of behaviours, kind of coping mechanisms that, again, specifically around self-harm, that deepened. Yes. And still remains today.
And it's right that at that point in July 2021, you identified from the people who responded a decline from the previous years, with nearly 30% of adults saying that their mental health had actually got worse.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Hughes, I want to ask you now about some specific aspects of Mind's work that may illustrate the impact on some of the people that you were helping. First, in relation to sport and physical activity. We'll hear shortly about the inquiry's systematic evidence review on mental health and well-being. And I think, Doctor, that you've been sent some sections from yes. that. And that describes several studies showing that a lack of physical activity is associated with worsening mental health. And Doctor, at paragraphs 28 to 42 of your statement, you talk a lot about the work you did about encouraging activity. Does that chime with what we've seen in our systematic review about worsening mental health being associated with lack of activity?
Absolutely. We have a firm belief that physical activity supports good mental health. And so again, when we could see the immediate decline, we were very clear that we needed to ramp up our physical activity across the piece. Thank
you. And it's right to say that this sort of work had been ongoing for some time prior to the pandemic.
Yes.
But as the pandemic hit, you saw increased demand, particularly when sports facilities closed.
Yes.
And at paragraph 36, I want to ask you about some specific points about physical activity, and it touches on what we've just been discussing. Some people didn't find it very easy to use physical activity to cope. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, many of the people that have serious mental illness have other coexisting physical issues too. And so the assumption that they could just go on a walk and actually quite often they were shielding. So yes. Indeed, all of these things conspired to make it very, very difficult for people to do all of the things that they might have done before. You know, they couldn't go swimming, for instance, for people with, really significant skeletal issues. So, we found that moment of when we were thinking through all of the support that we could provide, we wondered how we could meet that gap that we saw. But ultimately, we couldn't fill it entirely, because those health centres, those physical activity environments, etc., are incredibly important, and we absolutely couldn't replicate that. But what we did, what we were able to do, is provide peer support, provide encouragement, provide guidance. In fact, we had lots of walking groups across local mines, appropriately distanced, of course.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. One individual told you that they were exercising for up to 10 hours a day. You mentioned that. I just wanted to ask you about that physical activity wasn't an easy thing to give advice about.
No, you're quite right. And indeed, for certain groups, physical activity, if you're living with eating distress, for instance, physical activity can be incredibly problematic.
Yeah.
And excessive exercise is absolutely not great for your mental health either. So we had to be really cautious and thoughtful because we did not want to feed into that those messages. But equally, we really wanted to hold on to the value that physical activity could play. So again, those trauma-informed, and I kind of be really clear about that. Our physical activity services are trauma informed.
Yes.
And so from that perspective, being able to manage that distinction between harm and, kind of positive impact.
Yeah, it's a balance, essentially.
It's a balance, yeah.
And you, during the pandemic, you created, I think you've exhibited it to your witness statement. I don't need to take you to it, but a specific resource was on your website about healthy relationships with physical activity, and that was because of this
Absolutely,
need for
yes.
sort of quite nuanced and carefully balanced advice.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm just going to take you through just a couple of the other things that you mentioned that you developed in light of this concern about inactivity. You mentioned the delivery of 27,000 Get Active at Home leaflets and activity packs, and you delivered those because you were concerned about the digitally excluded, as I understand it. And I will turn now to the walking groups that you mentioned. So this is at paragraph 39 of your statement, and you describe these groups being set up, as well as the online peer support, to really keep people who are particularly isolated on track. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And primarily because we know that people with particularly serious mental illness have, a mortality rate of 15 to 20 years before
Yes.
the rest of the population. And so our desire to maintain healthy coping mechanisms, including physical exercise, was a priority. We felt deeply concerned that the deterioration in all of the physical activity would contribute even more so to that incredibly painful stat.
I'm just going to touch on that because we heard evidence yesterday about that striking statistic, and it's a pre-existing feature, severe mental illnesses and mortality rates being 15 to 20 years lower. But what you've described in your statement is something that was ongoing to try and address that statistic. Is that correct?
Yes.
But during the pandemic, is it right to say efforts to focus on that group were redoubled in terms of the mortality risk from not doing any physical exercise?
Indeed. So we know that people with serious mental illness were 5 times more likely to die during the pandemic, and physical health challenges were absolutely key and core to that. And so we knew that this would happen during the pandemic, and so our response was not just about supporting people's emotional health, but we needed to attack the physical health piece too, and providing walking groups, etc., was not the only intervention we took. We also assisted people with accessing vaccines and doing all of those things too, because we were really concerned about that
But
the impact of that overall.
It would be right to say this is a very hard to reach part of
Incredibly.
society. And you've described in your statement, paragraph 42.2, a lot has gone into that initiative. You've described Oxfordshire Mind, Active Oxford, Oxford and Mental Health Partnership, and funding from Sports England's Tackling Inactivity and Disadvantage Fund.
Yes.
So a lot goes into trying to devise something to shift that statistic.
Absolutely, it's been a very this has been the reality for people with serious mental illness for some time. So this is a known quantity. This has been something that we in the mental health community have been trying to attack, and physical activity is one way of doing it. And so we have been working with Sport England, and in fact our sports and physical activity work has been ongoing for about 15 years.
I'm just going to touch, before we move to another section of your statement, on a couple of other specifics that you have noted about the pandemic, again, related to physical health of the group we've been talking about. You say, at paragraph 20 of your statement, you became aware of some people with those severe illnesses being unable to access food because they weren't on the shielding list. Was that a feature that you noted in terms of physical health of people with mental illnesses?
Absolutely. So it was extraordinary that we found that people with serious mental illness were not immediately on the shielding registers. Even with SMI, serious mental illness registers across primary care, for some reason that was a largely excluded group. Not in every part of the country, but
There were some instances of that.
Yeah, quite a lot actually. I would probably say it was kind of 50-50 in terms of whether you were on the shielding list or not. And so the other part of that, though, is that in those instances, you would hope that mental health services then could step in and advocate for somebody, but that often lagged. That took some time to realise, well, who's missing, who actually needs this support, and it demanded mental health services to reach out, which was right, because actually, whilst we call it a hard-to-reach group, it's actually the fact that we don't reach them. So for us, it was really thinking through, how do we get to them? How do we identify these individuals? And that took time.
One last specific insight that you've offered, telephone hearings for mental health review tribunals, so the justice system, were devised, but you highlighted that could cause issues for patients, for instance, paranoia or hallucinations. Was that a specific impact of the pandemic measures that you recall that Mind advocated for?
Yes, I mean, we found far too many instances where those systems absolutely created impenetrable realities for these people who were very, very poorly. They couldn't access advocates in the same way. And so all of that whole system became, there was a lack of integrity to it for those reasons.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another topic. Dr. Hughes, your statement covers pretty much every aspect of Module 10's scope, and we've heard a lot about mental health in general terms, but you talk in your statement also about the impact on workers and your staff, which I just want to ask you about, because you raise a few points about your staff that have a broader resonance in some of the evidence we've already heard and will hear. Paragraph 45 of your statement, a particular feature of the pandemic you describe, and that is a rise in verbal and physical abuse of shop workers with heightened levels of mental distress. So you've mentioned that in your statement. Dr. Hughes, one of the documents that we sent you was from our round table for business leaders, and I wonder if that could just be put up on screen just to remind you of that. Essentially, what we found from others who discussed this issue was this. Representatives discussed how staff across their sectors faced increased workloads during the pandemic because of staff shortages and changes to how they interacted with customers. This increased their responsibilities at work and contributed to work-based stress. And for example, in the retail sector, staff had to enforce regulations like mask wearing, which increased verbal and physical abuse from customers who did not want to comply, and it had a negative impact on staff mental health and well-being. So it seems that this resonates with what you've described.
Oh, completely. And sadly, we still see this, there is a legacy to that. So we still see an increase in verbal and physical attacks on retail and hospitality staff. I doubt there's many of us in this room that wouldn't have seen an incident during the pandemic where a member of staff had to intervene or ask somebody to be compliant, etc., with regulations. And far too often there was a negative response. And whilst I think we can reflect and high levels of stress, high levels of worry and anxiety, but it was absolutely disproportionate. The impact on hospitality and retail staff's mental health has been quite astonishing too. And I think the fear has increased and remains, sadly. We saw, and again, we can explain some of that behaviour because of the lack of support elsewhere, the lack of community, the lack of being able to kind of maintain those social contacts and so on. So, we were all a little bit of a powder keg in many respects. But this really extended beyond anything I think most of us anticipated.
We heard somebody, I think, from the theatre industry in one of the roundtables describing almost a sense of people having forgotten how to behave. Is that something you think might be behind some of these incidents that you've described?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're in isolation for long periods of time, all of our normal or ordinary conventions disappeared overnight. So again, going to the shop or going to Tesco's or any other supermarket, these huge queues outside, all of these kind of psychological images of the pandemic that all of everybody, we're all kind of consumed by, we can still hold them in mind, right? And so, but we forgot, we literally forgot how to hold conversations. And, many people didn't see another person for days and days and days. And so, of course, we lost skills. We lost skills around compassion, actually. We kind of forgot that shop workers were also experiencing the pandemic as well. And so all of these things are still part of the legacy of the pandemic, and we're still seeing and feeling the effects of that today.
Back to the issue of what workers were going through, Mind compiled a workplace wellbeing index. You mentioned that from paragraph 42 of your statement, and that considered the experiences of over 42,000 staff over a range of industries during the pandemic. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you say it confirms some expected outcomes, such as furloughed workers reporting greater job satisfaction. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you also noted that on-site workers who felt supported by employers were the least likely to report worse mental health. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, Dr. Hughes, again, trying to get your insights about what works. What could a supportive employer do to support the mental health in the particularly stressful circumstances that you've described in your statement and we've seen in the roundtable report? How do you support staff, or how did you support staff having to experience that level of abuse and a sort of a new normal for behaviour?
I mean, it's incredibly difficult. And I think what's important is to first and foremost acknowledge the stress and the pressure that people are under. I think that kind of approach of denial is never going to be helpful. So, we very much acknowledged the pressure and stress. And of course, we also furloughed individuals. Our shops were closed, so an entire workforce were furloughed overnight. And I think what we found is the distinction was people who were furloughed, they had higher levels of well-being. However, those people who were remote working, for instance, they had a drop in their well-being. And that was often because they were experiencing increased pressure and demand because there were less people. So, concentrated areas of work. So I think that one of the things that had been helpful in environments, and certainly is about managing workload. So it's not just about creating the environment for good mental health. We can have conversations, we've got good policies, we've got a framework, etc., and we've got these resources you can access, but also tackling the fundamentals about how people work, how much they've got to work, and I think you can't do those two things separately. They need to be considered together.
Thank you. Dr. Hughes, you next turn in your statement specifically to the mental health on key work, the impact of mental health of key workers. And you restarted, you say, at paragraph 51, something called the Blue Light Programme that I'm going to ask you about. And that was to support emergency responders, including staff and volunteers working in the police, fire, ambulance, search and rescue services. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it's right to say again that the scheme had run in previous years, but it wasn't active at the start of the pandemic.
That's right. We recognised for a long time the mental health impacts on blue light workers and had an extensive programme, which was why when we went into the pandemic, we again immediately recognised this is going to hit the fan. So we really need to kind of work out what we're going to do to support our frontline staff.
Thank you. And you surveyed almost 4,000 of these workers, and you published again a report on their experiences and deteriorating mental health, and you've exhibited that to your statement as well.
Yes.
And you give a quote from one of these workers, that's at paragraph 59 of your statement. Please can we bring up, in fact it's already happened, INQ 000652569 at page 21. And this is an emergency responder who says, you drop them off, have I done the best for them? I might worry that I didn't do the right thing, or did I do the right thing leaving someone at home when we should have taken them in? But I try not to think about it because that's a recipe for disaster. So I just want to ask you a little bit about the mental health of some of these emergency responders. You've referred earlier, and also at paragraph 59, to the concept of moral injury. And the footnote to your statement says that's the psychological effects of witnessing human suffering or failing to prevent outcomes which go against deeply held beliefs. So for the emergency responders, is the deeply held belief in this context that you should be able to help people?
Indeed. And, it kind of fills me with great sadness when I think and reflect back on what happened to our emergency workers. And I think about that paramedic who would go out to a family with a very ill individual, could be a grandparent, parent, whatsoever, and seeing children, not really being able to have the resources to do very much other than maybe provide some oxygen, knowing that if they brought them to A&E that they may not survive. And I think that that always had existed, but during the pandemic, the threshold of that absolutely went through the roof. So people were not paramedics, as an example, were not going to a very difficult situation once a day or twice a day. This was every contact they were having was incredibly problematic, high stakes, incredibly worrying, with complex clinical realities that needed really unpicking, knowing that they didn't entirely have the resources to respond. And that was happening day in, day out, time and time again. And that is corrosive. It is corrosive on all of our health and care workers, and again has left a residue. I know personally many individuals who worked during the pandemic very closely with very sick individuals, and I don't know that they will ever recover from the decisions that they had to make during that time.
Now, Dr. Hughes, you're talking, for obvious reasons, about health and social care workers, but it's right to say as well that we've heard from police, fire and rescue, and it is the issue that they were also having to step in to provide services that they wouldn't normally do as part of their work, as, for instance, police.
Oh, my goodness, absolutely. And, of course, the police and fire also had very late PPE, etc., so they were at high risk in those, certainly in the early days. And, of course, they were also having to enforce new laws very, very quickly. The pressure and the stress and the scrutiny, which, again, continues today, but also made it feel, again, incredibly scary, an incredibly unsafe role to play in your local community, for instance. If you're talking to families, no, you can't sit that closely together in the park, or, actually they're responding to a home where somebody is incredibly suicidal. All of these factors absolutely are ongoing for the police. But during the pandemic, I think that one of the things that we kind of did is we divided our frontline workers into almost good and bad. And I think the police were in the sort of bad box. And, we did a lot of clapping, didn't we, for our NHS workers. We didn't really acknowledge that for any other part of the system that really kind of came out in force.
Well, Dr. Hughes, you've described something that was a key feature of what various key workers explained about their experience during the pandemic. So thank you very much for that. In terms of one other feature for key workers in particular, paragraphs 63 to 66, you're talking about the very real concern about spreading the virus, which we've already heard a lot of evidence about. And you've described, in summary, widespread fear about and anxiety about PPE, access to vaccines, testing, and the media coverage that you've described. Is that a fair summary of some of the concerns for these key workers?
Absolutely. So I'm going to share a bit of a personal example. My mother was a key worker during that time, and as a result, me and my family were shielding because I have a child with a serious medical condition. And my mum actually lives across the road from me, but we couldn't see each other for 3-4 months for the reasons that you've described. She was terrified of bringing the condition. She worked in a old people's home, very high risk environment. She was incredibly worried. So she was incredibly isolated. So not only was she worried about passing the virus on to us, she was alone. She was alone dealing with very, very poorly individuals with a very highly stressed workforce. An incredibly worried family. So all round, people felt incredibly worried all of the time. That fear about spreading the virus. And of course, even worse if you had older people in your family. And so we found emergency workers and key workers making the very difficult decision to leave family homes, to, be apart from their loved ones, for this very reason. And again, the impact on families, the legacy still remains.
Yes, we have heard again teachers as well deciding to leave the family home. Touching lastly on a point you make arising from the blue light research, and that is about respondents from BAME backgrounds being less likely to report their mental health getting worse, which you, I think in your statement at paragraph 72, express a bit of surprise about, considering the higher risk of infection and mortality risks in some of those groups. And you say you think maybe there's a need for the research to be more culturally competent. Can you briefly summarise what you mean by that in that context?
Yeah, so generally research comes from a very kind of normative model and therefore isn't often very culturally appropriate or thoughtful about what's going on in different communities. What we do know now is that actually in some of the black and minority ethnic groups that they have some protective factors because of family connections and community. So we do know that there are some protective factors as well as some high risk. So what we'd really like to see is some culturally appropriate research that is that can elaborate really on those protective factors to help us really unpick what happened during those really difficult moments, especially when we realised that people from black and minority ethnic communities were at higher risk of dying. So all in all, it is quite a peculiar outcome, particularly again when we couldn't have funerals in the way that we would normally have. So all in all, it is a bit of a surprising outcome, but we also know that this particular cohort have extraordinary mitigating factors as well.
Thank you. Dr. Hughes, I'm going to now ask you about some of the more vulnerable groups in society, and I'm going to pick up on a few questions that some of the other court participants have suggested we explore. Firstly, in relation to the clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable, you've said that those who are shielding Mind found were some of the most impacted by poor mental health. Is that correct?
Yes.
You describe loneliness and isolation, of course, but also some particular accounts experiencing resentment from colleagues because they were permitted to work from home. Is that correct?
Yeah, a really complicated picture. I think during the pandemic, obviously, many of us experienced that kind of sense of survival and looking at everybody else, what is everybody else doing? And so those dynamics absolutely were tricky, However, nonetheless, I think generally for people who were shielding, the risks around or the perceived risk of being infected was very, very high. So even, people would describe shopping being delivered and having to literally kind of bleach all of the packaging, etc. The kind of high levels of paranoia and worry, which was based on the very powerful messages that we were getting at the time around safety and infection control. And so for shielding families, and again, I can talk from experience, you were not able to have access to all of the things that others were doing in terms of physical activity, you couldn't have the hour a day. Even safe distancing wasn't often an option. And so the layering of isolation, fear, exclusion, and of course, for many of those groups who were shielding, they also had comorbidities, which meant that they also would be digitally excluded. So,
Yes.
it's not just a perfect storm. This is a perfect hurricane of factors.
Just finally on that, you've described confusion about guidance and anxiety about getting COVID when the in-person services resumed. So that's essentially a legitimate safety concern as well, but it was impacting on mental health.
Oh, absolutely. The fear of infection and the lack of infection control in mental health services conspired together to create a very, very poor picture.
Thank you. Moving on to briefly deal with what you say at paragraphs 99 to 105 about housing and homelessness. You point to another report from 2021. I don't need to take you to it, but it's focusing on poverty. And you say that homelessness, social deprivation, domestic abuse and substance abuse problems you describe that in your statement. And in terms of the report on poverty, you called this a confluence, a spiral of adversity.
Yes. You would have heard from Professor Marmont yesterday,
Yes,
and I would absolutely concur with everything that he would have outlined.
Thank you. And of course, you've described specific initiatives such as the Everyone In initiative and the eviction ban. And you've mentioned one group that benefited from the policies that were brought in were migrant groups with no recourse to public funds. Just a couple of questions I'm asked to ask you about that group, please. Later in your statement, you note a disproportionate effect or impact on people from racialised communities in terms of poor mental health, primarily related to housing problems. Would you agree that many migrants without recourse to public funds would also be amongst that particular group?
Yes.
And you've also been referred, I think, to part of a witness statement on behalf of the Migrants' Rights Commission, and that noted a high prevalence of mental health, in particular amongst asylum seekers who've experienced prior trauma. Is that consistent with your understanding of mental health in migrant groups?
Absolutely, because it's no surprise to many of us that often people who are seeking asylum, migrant groups, have already come from a place of trauma, already very, very vulnerable. And so, again, what we saw in the pandemic, and I don't use this word lightly, but people were being triggered time and time again, either because of fear, isolation, exclusion, and this kind of idea of not belonging anywhere or to anyone.
Thank you. Turning now to paragraph 106 of your statement, you've said there's a strong link between exposure to intimate partner abuse and the incidence of mental illness, and also that women with mental health problems are more likely to be domestically abused. A few questions on this group, please. A number of Mind reports note that speaking to family and friends online, spending time outside were the most common coping strategies, and we've seen that. Did you encounter such strategies being restricted by perpetrators exercising greater control over victims and survivors during lockdown?
Yes, I'm so utterly sad to talk and think about this, but absolutely that's true. I think where there were instances of domestic violence or coercion in homes, absolutely created an increased layer of isolation for victims. Often we heard stories about people not able to have the hour a day, not being able to retain any contact with friends or family, experiencing extreme levels of violence and not being able to get the care to attend to those injuries. And so absolutely it created a terribly, terribly vulnerable group with children.
So you've got perpetrators controlling movements, access to technology and social connections. Is that correct?
Yes.
And lack of access to mental health services during lockdown in that environment would have a particular impact on this group?
Absolutely, and our ability as workers really compromised in terms of being able to know what's going on. So I come back to that point around, if we're doing remote consultations, we are limited in what we can see and know about the individual. Injuries can be hidden, what's going on in the environment can be hidden, and so our ability to intervene was deeply compromised.
And services going online clearly presented particular challenges that you described for that group.
Yes.
Thank you. Turning to people detained in prisons and detention centres, I think you say that Mind hasn't conducted any specific research on that.
No, but I worked at the Centre for Mental Health at the time when we were commissioned by NHS to do a review of mental health in the prison service.
So I think you've said at paragraph 109 there was significant concern about that population during the pandemic and an understanding that there was a considerable deterioration in the mental health of detained people.
Absolutely. So this is already an incredibly vulnerable cohort. This is, a group often that has anything between 75 and 90% of people going into prison have some sort of mental health or learning disability, or some vulnerability of some kind. So this is already a very vulnerable group of people. What we saw during the pandemic is mental health support flatlined, again, overnight. We also saw a massive increase in the amount of time people were held in cells, for instance, that often didn't meet human rights regulations. So exercise wasn't really an option. There were massive delays in accessing medication. There were massive delays in staff accessing PPE. So, distance, therefore they had to keep huge distances between officers and prisoners. We saw a lack of ability, a lack of contact with family and friends. So any of those protective factors again disappeared overnight. And for people with serious mental illness, not being able to access medication, for instance, is life-threatening.
Thank you. I'm going to turn finally to your observations about the experience of the bereaved at paragraph 116 of your statement. Again, the inquiry has received and will be hearing more evidence about this from other witnesses. I just want to ask you about one of the many case studies you present from a bereaved individual who's spoken to Mind, and it was mentioned in your opening statement as well on behalf of Mind. You cover the experience earlier in the statement at paragraphs 93 to 97, the experience of disrupted mental health services, essentially, and what the account involves is a very negative experience during the pandemic in terms of the healthcare provided to a loved one before they died. And in summary, she says that her father was admitted to hospitals under the Mental Health Act, was not allowed visitors. She's very concerned about the adverse effect of that on him, and that sadly he died from complications of COVID. So that's what happened. In terms of what she's been left with, and you describe it in your statement, she's left with many concerns about his care, ventilation and testing. And then moving on to his death, she wasn't able to see his body. There were only 10 mourners allowed at his funeral. And she explains, and you set this out in your statement, a huge amount of resentment about what happened and a lack of closure. So just taking that one example that you've cited quite a lot in your statement, can I ask you, do you think that having multiple layers of distress at each stage of the loss and bereavement process, does that have a particularly bad impact in terms of closure in the bereavement process, in your view?
Absolutely. And first and foremost, I think I just want to say that Mind stands in heart and solidarity with all of those families who lost loved ones during those terrible days. I think that it absolutely does. And we, again, are seeing the legacy of that today. We are seeing complex grief for the reasons that you describe. At every point of the story that you've highlighted, all of the ordinary things that you would expect a family family to be able to do were taken away. And so not only did the individual die alone, effectively, the family also were unable to provide the support that they wanted to and that they could have provided if they were allowed to. So all of these aspects, I think, have again conspired to create a legacy of grief that we still as a nation are not really understanding. The 10,000 children who lost a primary caregiver, all of those funerals that were not done in the way that we would have wanted to. We can see in racialised communities particularly where the ritual of funerals that we couldn't deliver on, the legacy and the pain of that still remains deeply within families. I think that we're seeing complex grief, but we're also seeing post-traumatic stress disorder as well as a result of that. And I certainly, again, can use many personal examples where, we had to speak to a dying loved one over an iPad or, a funeral online. And all of these things, again, do not create the ending or the natural process that you undertake when you're grieving.
And do you see this, which has affected so many people, as a driver for persistent symptoms of poor mental health?
Absolutely. And the government are obviously undertaking a prevalence review of mental health at the moment. And certainly bereavement is, a core factor for exploration and inquiry. The reality is that the entire fabric of how we support people who are dying, the families, and what happens afterwards completely disappeared. And so all of the things that we would usually do were unavailable to us. And if, we can cast our minds to those moments when a loved one is in those last moments and you're having to be online, you can't hold them, touch them, kiss them, the legacy of that is forever. That doesn't disappear.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes. I'm going to finally touch on the lessons learned from the pandemic in terms of the impact on mental health as you've described it. You set that out in a series of recommendations that are at different points, 3 points in your statement. The first set, I don't need to take it to you, I'll just draw out some of the main points. That was at paragraph 49 relating to the general population. And it's fair to say that some of those are essentially calls for action on issues that already existed during the pandemic, for instance, inequalities. But it's right to say that the pandemic brought into sharp focus some of those priorities. Would that be a fair way of describing it?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, all of the things that those of us who've been in the sector for a long time already knew, sadly came home to roost during the pandemic in very glaring and catastrophic ways. And I think that our primary recommendation, alongside the demand for a recognition of mental health surge planning in the overall pandemic planning approach, is really that we must tackle the inequality that people are experiencing. We saw far too many people die. We saw far too many people develop mental health challenges, but also deepen their mental illness. And so all around, what we can see from an inequality perspective, it's a key driver. It is catastrophically harming the nation still today. And sadly, the pandemic accelerated the deepening of inequalities for far too many families, particularly those with comorbidities, mental and physical health challenges.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that summary. Can I just draw out a couple of the lessons that seem to be most specific to everything you've explained about the COVID pandemic? You mentioned normalising workplace conversations and embedding mental health considerations in workplace practices. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we saw that in particular as part of what you described as the learnings from the Blue Light programme and the Workplace Wellbeing Index.
Yes, we have to create the conditions in all aspects of society for mental health conversations to happen, but also mental health literacy and also the ability to access help when you need it. So it's not just good enough to talk. Workplaces need to be able to do that. they also need to be able to provide resources, and they also need to be able to signpost people to help when they need it. And I think all around, during the pandemic, that did emerge over time, and we saw that some brilliant work across many industries and sectors. But again, we're seeing a decline in that approach now. And so if another pandemic were to happen tomorrow, I'm not entirely sure those lessons have been really deeply embedded in the fabric of the way that we think about work.
That is what you'd like to see.
100%.
Secondly, you've talked about, importance of physical activity and use of social prescribing, and all of that is born out of what you've described about the activities and initiatives that you provided during the pandemic.
Yes.
And the second set of key points at paragraph 86 are specific to key workers. Again, it's the importance of prioritising mental health. We don't need to touch on that again. But in terms of that specific issue about key workers being public-facing and needing to enforce restrictions and the abuse they might face, you've essentially suggested that some sort of quite tailored support is needed for that. Is that correct?
Indeed, because it rests on so many factors. I mean, especially if you think about small communities where, you know, somebody might be aggressive or violent in a shop, but that affects the entire community, right? So all relationships get damaged. So in terms of the impact, the kind of halo effect of all of these things, it's not just on shop workers, it will be on their families too. So we do need to think about a tailored intervention. We do need to be able to support individuals, but we also need to manage the risk of that. So it's not just about giving them the tools maybe to de-escalate or to understand a mental health crisis, but also to be able to keep themselves safe. And how do we do that in terms of, you know, alarms, making sure that they do have relationships with the police locally and regionally. And I think all of those things, both practically and kind of philosophically in terms of how we should be thinking about these things, need to come to bear.
And finally, I'll just run through 4 specific points that come from your statement shortly. Specific issues about challenging self-stigma, particularly emergency workers, as you've described, in terms of vulnerable people, the importance of access to PPE for both mental health wards and others like charities such as yourself. And finally, you note the need for expanded suicide and bereavement support services. Those seem to me to be the most pandemic-specific learnings. Is there anything else that I've missed?
No, I think that the only thing I'd probably add is that as we plan the next decade of mental health interventions, I would urge the government to make sure that they take on the learnings of what happened in the pandemic and create mental health services that attend to the legacy of that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hughes. There may be some other questions for you.
Thank you.
There are. Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Weatherby's just there.
Thank you. Dr. Hughes, I represent COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, and in fact the family member whose case you highlighted with respect to her father who was under a section, so I thank you for that. Just one very short point from us, and it goes back to some evidence you gave at the start of this session. In your statement at paragraph 9, you say that there has been a marked increase in the level of distress displayed by our beneficiaries during contact, with many citing that they are unable to access services, and that's at the beginning of the pandemic, and that's the evidence you were giving. Did that include the inability of bereaved people to seek access to bereavement support, as well as more general mental health?
Yes,
access?
I'm afraid it did in the early days.
Yes. And that leads to your recommendation that needs to be ramped up in future.
Absolutely. It has to be a core part of mental health services going forward. I mean, obviously grief is not a mental health issue per se, but pandemic-related grief becomes a mental health issue. Yes. And so our very clear recommendation is that that must be taken into consideration in the future, especially around the impact on families, but also in terms of the the type of services that we support. So this is not just kind of, ordinarily grief support would be very kind of gentle and
Yes.
low-key. We're talking about complex PTSD or complex grief, which demands a clinical intervention.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Weatherby. Ms Douglas, who's that way?
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr Hughes. I act for clinically vulnerable families. In your statement at paragraph 98.2, and it's where you're describing some of the insights provided by local minds, you reported that the anxiety of avoiding catching COVID-19 and spreading it to vulnerable relatives was felt more acutely prior to lockdown, when clinically vulnerable people felt helpless to protect themselves from getting infected. And then you go on to note that after lockdown restrictions started to ease, a top concern was about members of the public refusing to adhere to social distancing and other infection control measures. Would you agree that for clinically vulnerable people and those living with clinically vulnerable relatives, the mental health impact increased as restrictions eased because they were left to manage their elevated risk from infection alone without society-wide protective measures?
Oh, absolutely. We heard from individuals that it felt like a cliff edge, that all of the protective factors had disappeared, that they suddenly become almost like a kind of polarised group of people who often were not just kind of frightened, but in some instances kind of humiliated and mocked for that anxiety in the long term. And all of those factors impacted mental health in the long term. So this group were incredibly vulnerable and continue to be vulnerable for quite some time after the pandemic. And even now, the legacy of the pandemic has been, when you hear, so for instance, before Christmas, we had that kind of flu, we're in crisis with flu. For those individuals, immediately brought back to that sense of fear, risk, isolation, worry. And so, again, the legacy of that has continued, sadly. And certainly, again, I can use our own experience as a shielding family. When the restrictions came to an end, we did feel that sense of abandon because of, not knowing how we would be able to survive in this world that, where individuals were not maintaining safe distance, etc. And that took some time to kind of get over.
Thank you, Ms Douglas. I'm so sorry, Sergidis, over that way.
Grateful, my lady. Dr Hughes, my name is Miss Sergidis. I represent the domestic abuse group. I'm just going to start with the first topic, which is housing and homelessness. Paragraph 100 of your statement, you probably have it in front of you, you describe the spiral of adversity experienced by people with mental health problems who are more likely to experience homelessness, social deprivation, domestic abuse and substance abuse. During the pandemic, women fleeing domestic abuse struggled to access mental health services more generally, and housing support simultaneously. For example, in the DA group's evidence, the second largest reason women were refused emergency accommodation at specialist services was that their mental health needs were too great to be managed safely. That's in the DA group's evidence. Would you agree that this intersection of mental health needs and domestic abuse created a particularly acute service gap during the pandemic? Yes, and again, I think that the legacy of that continues on children and families and victims of domestic abuse. Absolutely, it was a significant gap and one that increased every day. And again, our ability to really discern what was happening for individuals was compromised. Our usual safeguarding mechanisms, again, disappeared overnight. And so, absolutely, this group was incredibly vulnerable. We know that the figures, in some instances, up 300% in terms of the violence and abuse, particularly women were experiencing. And again, that creates a legacy of PTSD, complex needs, and again, the legacy on children and young people is significant. Yes, I think you've spoken evidence about workers being compromised, they couldn't quite access what was going on.
Yes.
Turning to the second topic, which relates to key workers. And again, you've given very clear evidence to that this morning. Refuge workers were working on the front line, potentially exposing themselves to the virus, while simultaneously assisting and dealing with victims, survivors and their trauma at the most intense periods during the pandemic. And I think you dealt with this in your oral evidence, and I think you also deal with it, of course, in your witness statement at page 17. Do you agree that the poor rates of mental health amongst those working or volunteering on the front line, and the examples you've given, such as the police, fire, ambulance, retail and education frontline workers, also applies to workers in the violence against women sector?
Absolutely, and I think I just want to acknowledge that many workers who work in the violence against women or domestic violence sector will also have lived experience. So either past lived experience, which is why they work in the sector, and of course, all of us who work in the system generally are also part of this world, and so many of us also experienced domestic abuse during that time. So again, the combination of dealing with the most vulnerable women under the most incredibly painful and frightening circumstances, perhaps with your own experiences too, understanding that you couldn't help. So not only have you got lived experience, you're seeing somebody in terrible distress and you know that you can't provide the support, i.e. moral injury. The combination of those factors is, again, catastrophic. So, yes, I would agree. And
just to follow on from that, Dr. Hughes, the evidence from the DA group is that whilst their workers worked incredibly hard and were dedicated during this period, and of course, more broadly, the sector has since experienced high rates of staff turnover and burnout.
Yes.
And I think you've briefly touched on that as well. Would you say that account is on par with your observations about blue light staff and some of the other frontline workers you've referred to? I
absolutely agree, and I can see that across the board we have seen an increase in burnout, sick days. I think 9.4 or 10, nearly 10 sick days have increased, across the board because of the impact of the pandemic, in my view. And I think that of particular concern is that we were unable to intervene in terms of understanding the particular trauma on staff because the business carried on.
Yeah.
So there has been no opportunity to stop. And of course there isn't, because people still need us. People still need us to be there. The reality is that this work is incredibly painful, and during the pandemic, particularly painful, and the legacy of that continues. And I think that the issue of burnout is one that we must attend to as a matter of urgency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes, you said that one of the roles of Mind is to advocate for those who suffer from mental health problems and issues and illness. If I may say so, you are an extraordinary advocate for Mind. You have been a very, very powerful witness, and I'm extremely grateful to you for the help that Mind has been given to the inquiry, and obviously excellently represented by Mr. Pisani, but also for the help that you've given. It's been a very interesting morning.
Thank you, my lady. I really appreciate that.
Very well, I shall return at 25 to.
All right.
Sorry.
My lady, may I call the next witness, Professor Sarah Stewart-Brown?
Yes.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
sincerely and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Professor Stewart-Brown, thank you for coming to help us and for the work you've done for us so far. I think you know what's going to happen. I think you've been following proceedings for the last few minutes. Ms. Rahman.
Thank you.
Professor, could you give your full name, please?
Yes, I'm Sarah Stewart-Brown.
Thank you. And Professor, you should have in front of you a copy of a report which is entitled Systematic Evidence Review, the Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Mental Health and Wellbeing of the UK Adult Population, reference INQ 000659787.
Yes.
Thank you. And you've also, Professor, provided us with a brief statement, INQ 000549365. And in that, you confirmed that you were the senior academic consultant for the Centre for Strategy and Evaluation Services, and they were appointed by the inquiry to prepare the review. Is that correct?
It is.
Thank you. Professor, can you confirm that any facts stated within the review are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And can you also confirm that any opinions you've stated represent your true and complete professional opinion?
You can. Yes.
Thank you. Now, Professor, turning first to your professional background, in summary, you are the Emeritus Professor of Public Health at the University of Warwick.
Yes.
And you're also an expert advisor to several research projects and programmes.
Yes.
And you've also advised the English, Scottish and Welsh governments on public mental health in a variety of contexts.
Yes, public mental health was my specialist area within public health.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor, turning to page 7 of the review, and can I have that up on screen, please? It's INQ 000659787, page 7. And this sets out the review's research questions. And just so we all know what this document is doing, it is looking at how did the general UK adult population's mental health and well-being change during the pandemic, and the period was approximately March 2020 to June 2022. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
But I think we see at some point some of the research goes a little bit further than that, and you touch on that during the course of the review occasionally.
Yes, it's important that this was focused on the general population. So people like you and me, people who didn't necessarily have any defining factors before it, but that population includes, 20% of that population do have a mental illness.
Right. Yes.
And, a lot will be parents, or there are particular groups within the population. And so when the general population studies may well also look at the sizable groups within the general population and make a comment on them.
Yes, thank you. So you're talking there about what we mean by the general UK adult population. It does, in fact, include some people with severe conditions. We'll come back to definitions of mental health in a moment. Yeah. Let me move to the second question. What were the risk and protective factors for changes in mental health and well-being relative to pre-pandemic trends? And I don't need to take you to it, but there's a glossary to the review that explains what is meant by a risk or protective factor. And in summary, it says a risk factor increases the chance of a negative outcome, whilst a protective factor reduces that chance or helps improve outcomes. Can you give us an example?
Yes, so for example, smoking might increase your risk of getting cancer, but it doesn't dictate that you will get cancer.
So it's just a risk factor.
It's just a risk factor.
And, for instance, a protective factor might be, for instance, wealth or something like that in terms of mental health. Thank you. And then on that second question again, on page 7, it says that where data allows a range of specific focus areas, risk factors, protective factors, demographic characteristics, or geographic location have been examined, and you did that to understand how different specific groups or populations were affected.
Yes, indeed. And I think we're going to come on to a little bit about the methodology, but the point about systematic reviews is you try and find every possible study that could be relevant to your topic, and then you weed them down further from there. But you are constrained by what research has been published.
Yes, indeed. We're going to come up to that now. Can I bring up the review, INQ 000659787, page 8, please? And that talks about the methodology. And just to understand the scale of what was involved that you and your team were looking at, there were over 5,700 sources, studies essentially on mental health in the pandemic, of which 2,700 were unique. Does that mean that there were a lot of references to the same study? Or is
there were lots of duplicates. Yeah, and this research might be published in the same way in different journals.
And then you there's a lot to the report. There's also a technical report attached to it explaining how you identified what was a study that was robust. We'll come back to that. You included 118 studies, and ultimately you excluded some of those because of quality checks, and we've ended up with a list, and it's still 98 high-quality studies, essentially.
Yes, that's true.
And can I just ask you, the fact that you've got so many studies and sources all looking at the issue of the pandemic and the impact on the population's mental health, does that tell you anything about the extent of the impact? Or why was it, do you think, that so many of these studies had looked at this particular issue?
Well, because I think people in the research community were extremely concerned to document and find out what was going on in the pandemic. I think one of the other things about this is that some of the rules which would usually be there for research studies and would enable you to get grant funding were relaxed a bit in the pandemic because there was this real big concern to try and find out what was going on. So there were more studies published, for example, on invitations for people to take part in them rather than selecting a random sample of the population. So you just need to be a bit more careful about who was part of that study and who wasn't.
So what you've done, you and your team have done, is gone through many, many different studies and resources, all of which were devised with the very laudable aim of trying to work out what happened, but you have fine-tuned the selection to something that we can really draw some conclusions on.
And I suppose the large number is just evidence the fact that if you look at the technical report, you can see all the search terms. And so the review did aim to specifically identify any studies that were relevant to any of the risk or protective factors. And then you have to weed out which of those are actually just commentaries. There's actually no data in them. Or, there are people talking about other people's studies and hone down on the ones that have got useful data that they're presenting.
Thank you so much. Can I ask, again, same INQ reference, but page 13, which you have essentially stressed some limitations, which I'll just take you through very quickly. Essentially, the quality of the studies varied, the measures used weren't always consistent, so in terms of definition of mental health, we'll come back to that, data availability, and certain groups, again, we've heard about this, we'll come back to it, such as people from minority ethnic groups, disabled people, those in institutionalised settings, people without internet access were often underrepresented. So we'll come back to those at the end, but those were the sorts of limitations that still apply, notwithstanding this rigorous filtering process.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. And then if I could ask you there to look, same INQ reference, page 14, this is the traffic light system that anyone reading the review will recognise. It's a visual way of explaining some of the points that you've just explained. And I will just ask you about the right-hand column, essentially. If you see a traffic light with the red traffic light, it essentially means low confidence in the findings. So notwithstanding the filtering process, it sounds as if you've still got a few in the mix, as it were, where there are, in fact, some major flaws that you identify. Is that correct?
Yes, but I think that's taking into account the fact there are some populations which are seriously difficult to study.
Yes.
The homeless don't feature in any of these studies because you can't involve them in these sort of studies.
Yes.
So where people have made an effort to study a difficult-to-reach population, even though the methodology is not quite up to the scratch with the others, we would want to have it included there because it gave the best evidence that was available.
Thank you. That's a really helpful explanation for why we still do see some of those studies there. And then more easy to understand, the amber light, reasonable confidence, but some issues around size, generalisability, and then finally the high confidence, well-designed, high-quality studies. Yeah. Thank you very much. Can I then bring up page 14 again, under 1.4 on that page. This is about defining mental health, and just want to ask you about that. What you've said, or the review says there, is that there is quite a lot of confusion about the term mental health because it's used to synonymously mean mental illness. Do you mean by that sometimes people say something has affected their mental health, and what they mean by that is adversely?
That's how it's very often used, that term. Yep.
And you use the term differently as a continuum, so spanning from the presence of a really severe mental condition at one end and positive well-being at the other. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think this is a really important point throughout, because we're talking about the population's mental health, and that does span from serious mental illness or common mental disorders, psychological distress, right through to mental well-being at the other end. And it is mental well-being in many texts is now defined as feeling good and functioning well, and every psychiatric diagnosis is made on the basis of feeling bad or functioning poorly. So there is a continuum there. But I think the point to recognise there is that most of us muddle along somewhere in the middle of this continuum, and up to 50% of us will drop into the category of clinical mental health problems, mental illness at some stage or another. So there's a lot to be covered in this. But if I can go on from there, these studies use slightly different definitions of mental health or mental illness, and many of them divided the population, so they would use a scale, but they would decide on a particular cut point in the scale. This side of that cut point, you would be in the psychologically distressed or depressed or anxious category, and the other side, you'd be fine. And those studies produce information which is very easy to understand. So we had 20% of the population were psychologically distressed before, and afterwards there's 30%, and that's easy to grasp, but it misses a lot of data. So if you then turn to an approach where you're looking at a mean, an average, and some confidence intervals around that in a general population and how that shifted, you get a much more nuanced and statistically robust result. But it's more difficult for people to understand.
Yes.
So both have their value, and I think most of the studies on mental health problems of one sort or another analyse data in that way, whereas the studies of mental well-being and the various different ways of measuring that, like life satisfaction or happiness or engagement with life, they'd much more look at a continuum.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. You've done a really good job of explaining something that's quite complicated. We heard yesterday from another witness, an expert witness, who was saying that simply ticking boxes meets a threshold for a diagnosis, doesn't meet it. It means that you miss some of the nuanced data that can be quite helpful to understand impact.
Well, and I think another important fact is that in the non-clinical range, the range of mental health that's not of interest to psychiatrists, your level of mental health within that continuum has huge implications for future physical health,
yes.
Health service usage, productivity, sickness absence, all those things. So
yes.
It matters.
Yes,
and
yes.
you cut that out of studies where you've gone for what's called a dichotomy. You've cut the population in two.
Thank you, Professor. Now, in terms of the review's period of analysis, I would like you now just to take you to page 15 again. It's the review INQ 000659787. And you touch here on the broad periods of time that the review has taken in terms of analysing the impact on mental health and well-being. So first, the description there of the pre-pandemic period, which you've taken from 2017 to 2020. And in describing that period, it's essentially said that it was characterised by uncertainty, and you refer to Brexit, austerity, public service cuts, housing, insecurity, and unaffordability. And you're flagging this, I take it, because in the context of mental health, those sorts of factors could affect people's mental health and well-being.
Yes, and during the, up until the pandemic, there was evidence that mental health problems were on the rise.
And then looking at the next period, the post-pandemic period that you're looking at, you have highlighted March to June 2020, which is broadly characterised as the first lockdown period, because that's the sort of time when you'd expect to see, I take it, some sort of impact, or it would be worthwhile looking at that sort of time period because of the lockdown and people's mental health suffering.
Yes, but I think it's also important to point out in terms of methodology, the particular study may not have started in March or may not have started. There were different time periods depending on the data sets people could access and the questions that have been asked in them at the particular time.
Yes.
So we were putting together an overview of data from many different studies.
So you've done the best you can, despite the fact all of these studies are taking slightly different times, to try and work out what you can say in a robust analysis about that particular period, what happened to people in the first lockdown.
Yep.
Thank you. And then just to touch on some of these other time periods on the next page, easing and summer, that is July to October 2020. And we remember, and you remind us, it was characterised by hospitality and leisure venues reopening, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, further easing. But then towards the end of the period, we have increasing case numbers and, of course, the rule of six and things like this. So that's another sort of description of what the country was, in colloquial terms, going through during that period of time.
And I think a certain amount of uncertainty about whether what the recommendations were coming out were the best option for that period. So there was a lot of uncertainty then, wasn't there? And a lot of relief. Both.
Of course.
Yeah.
And then penultimate time period for the review, the second and third lockdowns. And you've pointed out that one of the sort of main events of that period of time was the COVID-19 vaccine being administered and the gradual reopening of services and public spaces. And the final period that you look at, and again, time periods may vary, but from April 2021, the stepwise restriction lifting by mid-2022. That was the time at which you've taken the lifting of most restrictions. Yep. And you do say there that you then see in that last period, presumably from the studies, an overlap with other societal pressures such as the cost of living crisis.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks.
And I think it's worth pointing out that the searches were done in October 2025. So we'd hope to pick up any studies that were reporting on information up to that. But it takes quite a long time to do these studies and then to publish them. So actually the last data we have is from 2023.
Thank you very much, Professor. That's a very helpful time for us to now come to the findings of the review. So if I can bring up the review again, INQ 000659787 at page 17. And that, filtering all of the evidence that you've reviewed, is what the pattern over those periods of time tends to suggest. So if I could just ask you, please, Professor, just explain these findings with the benefit of that slide in front of you to us.
Yes. Well, I don't think it'll be any surprise to anybody to discover that the pandemic had a pretty dramatic effect on population mental health. And, from the first lockdown on, rates of mental health problems, psychological distress, and mental illness rose. Whilst it eased during the lockdown periods and then went up again when more restrictions came on, it didn't fall back to where it had started from. And by 2023, we're still seeing quite a significant rise in the levels of mental health problems relative to pre-pandemic levels.
And the pre-pandemic levels, perhaps worth commenting upon, even before the pandemic, nearly 1 in 5, 19.4% of adults, did report psychological distress. That was before the pandemic, with certain groups more affected. But that has gone up during lockdown, unsurprisingly. And then you've got a partial rebound. Could I just ask you, about that. In terms of the partial rebound, are there things such as employment that are particularly relevant to why some people rebound and some people do not after lockdown?
Well, I think we'll probably go that in looking at the more specific factors. So these were just really looking at the general trends. I think what might be more important to add is that overall picture that we've painted hides different trajectories. So for a proportion of the population, you can see their mental health getting worse as soon as the lockdowns come in and never really recovering. And then there are other groups where the population's mental health went up and then recovered a bit during the pandemics and went lockdowns and then the easing and then came up again afterwards. And there were some people whose were in between that group. But if you look at a purely binary cut point between psychological distress and not, you could suggest that maybe 50% of the population were resilient and 50% dropped into that category of mental health problems during the pandemic. But amongst those in the 50% who were apparently resilient, you can see the changes in mental well-being happening even that group.
Thank you. Earlier on in your evidence, you were explaining to us about this area of mental health, which is perhaps not as striking as some of the very severe impacts that we have heard about, but which nonetheless have a real impact in terms of time off work, ability to function. I just want to ask a bit more about that, which we can get most easily from your summary of what happened in the first lockdown. So again, review INQ 00065977, page 19. In the initial lockdown, towards the bottom of the page, just to remind us what we're talking about in terms of impact on mental health during this period: concentration difficulties, sleep problems, feeling a lack of role and purpose, and just an inability to enjoy daily activities. Can I ask you just for a few key points arising out of those sorts of factors that are set out?
Yes, so these are the sort of things that people might use to get a handle on mental well-being that wasn't at the level of being ill.
Yes.
And these are things that commonly go wrong when people aren't doing so well. We're looking here particularly at the negative aspects of them, but it would be more appropriate possibly to measure the people who were still sleeping well rather than those who weren't.
And what seems to be quite a striking statistic towards the end, inability to enjoy daily activities. That was the most significant deterioration. And you go from 16.8% of people saying that in 2019 to 46.2% in April 20.
Yep, exactly.
And so these aren't people who are reporting severe mental health conditions, but an inability to actually enjoy life very significantly.
Well, these are people like you and me.
Well, you make a lot of assumptions, but yes, indeed. So moving on to the impact not being experienced equally. Professor, we've heard a lot of evidence about this and pre-existing inequalities. I don't need you to delve into it in a lot of detail, but in summary, you have pointed out in the review on a number of occasions that pre-existing inequalities have clearly played a huge amount of significance in how people have been impacted by the pandemic. Just in a few sentences, could you explain why you have stressed that so many times during the course of the review?
Yes, I mean, we'll go into this, I think, in more detail, but there's no doubt that there were pre-existing groups in the population who were vulnerable suffered worse. And there's a few anomalies in that we can look at. But I don't think this is of any surprise. I mean, if you take a group of people who are vulnerable and you lob something enormous at them like the pandemic, they will be less resilient to the effects of it than people who start off from a resilient perspective.
Of course.
And I think that covers pretty much all the groups we were able to look at because there was data available.
Thank you very much, Professor. So the review has drawn these large conclusions about how people have reacted across the course of those 5 time periods. The final time period, you've identified that in the longer term, there are still very elevated levels of distress despite the lifting of restrictions. And one question I've been asked to explore with you is whether or not you think that could be related in some way to the number of people experiencing bereavement, given the scale of bereavement that was experienced by the population and perhaps the long-term nature of it, which the inquiry's heard some evidence of. Was that any part of the reviews that you looked at, a specific focus on bereavement?
There was nothing in the review evidence to be able to say one way or the other. I mean, I am sure that there were very few people in the pandemic who experienced a good death,
yes.
And a bad death had huge implications for the bereaved. But they still, whilst there was a huge number of people died in the pandemic, the bereaved families still represent a relatively small proportion of the population in total.
Yes.
And so the effect on their mental health is unlikely to be the cause of these statistics that we've seen.
Because what you're looking at is very broad, population-wide type statistics, so some of these groups aren't represented in high numbers.
There's not enough of them statistically to create the effect that we saw in the data.
Thank you, that's very clear. So the next part of your report is part of you looking at the review at very specific demographic groups, and that is from pages 27, my lady, to 63 of the review. And is it right, Professor, that what you've attempted to do there is take some specific groups or factors, and I'll list them in a minute, and what you've done is look at the evidence base and try and summarise, again, over those 5 periods, exactly what each group was doing in terms of their reaction and their mental health during the pandemic?
Yes, we've done the best job we can, but you're short of studies in lots of places,
yes.
and the evidence isn't robust. But could I just go back there?
Do.
So there were a couple of points that came out of the general population studies we've referred to already. And one was a study that attempted to look at the stringency of lockdown measures and see whether they could predict what was happening to mental health at the time. And this study did find that the stringency of lockdown predicted how much impact there was on mental health, which I think is important because one of the things about the pandemic and all this data is it's very difficult to tease out the effect of this very frightening virus from the effect of the control measures. And some control measures were inevitable, but there were choice around which control measures. And so it's important to know, it's important to be able to find out, to the extent you can, which was the driving force. So that's one point. And I think the other point, which is relevant, is quite a lot of these studies suggested that people whose mental health was more compromised to begin with, or at the lower level of the wellbeing spectrum, were more likely to get infected.
Physically affected?
The virus was more likely to infect them and more likely to affect them severely, and there was higher mortality rates.
Thank you, that's very interesting. I'm going to move back to the specific factors, unless there's anything else, Professor. It's a huge report, so if there's anything that we've missed.
Those were the two things I just wanted to...
Thank you. So what the next bit of the report does is it does, I think you've said you've done the best that you can, but leading back to the point about data gaps, you've gone through and you've said at each stage, well, at this stage of the pandemic, there's less evidence. And is it right that comparing all of those different factors that I will list in a moment, it helps you identify where you're really short of data, but just that exercise in itself would assist you to do that?
Yes, yes.
And the factors that you have covered are by reference to the following 14 areas: age, gender, ethnicity and race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, occupation, housing and residential status, geographical differences, parents, pregnancy and maternity, caring status, disabled people and individuals with chronic illnesses, clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable individuals, and finally health status. So it's a huge endeavour,
Yes,
Professor.
and what we're doing is presenting whatever studies we could find in those particular groups.
Thank you. Now, Professor, obviously I'm not going to go through each and every part of the pandemic by reference to that, but we have, through various core participants, had some assistance with identifying some key questions about just the last few of those groups and the way that the review has approached it. So if I can ask you a few questions about that. The last three were, firstly, disabled people and individuals with chronic illnesses, and the last one was health status. So just in relation to that, it's been pointed out that both of those sections, the disability and individuals with chronic illnesses and, secondly, health status, both of those sections will include conditions and impairments that have a substantial or long-term adverse effect on the ability to carry out day-to-day activities. Yep. And so, for instance, we see, if you delve into that section, you've got chronic illnesses in both, things like chronic pain, long-standing illnesses. Is that correct? You've got that occurring in both those sections?
Yes, because there's a huge overlap, and you're limited to the definitions people have made in the particular paper you're looking at. So you then have to extrapolate from that there's some people with chronic illness in this group, so the data might be relevant.
Would you say then that you should take those two sections together to get the full picture about the impact on people with disabilities?
Yes.
Thank you. Just again, a very specific point that's been asked about this. Please help us if you're able to. Appreciate that it's a very long report. But the review says that at paragraph 3.2.12, whilst there was overall mental distress, the increase in people with disabilities or those with pre-existing health conditions was smaller or not statistically significant compared to non-disabled or those without the pre-existing health conditions. And the question is this: are you able to say whether that's against a sort of significantly higher baseline amongst those groups?
Yes, and I think we're going to see this in another group, and particularly one of those papers. I mean, the focus of the paper was something else, but you find this little nugget in the last couple of paragraphs of the results, and it is clearly pertinent to people with chronic illness or, health conditions can just be physical health problems, or it can include all mental health problems. Disability can be defined very differently in these different surveys. So, yes, there seemed to be in those studies something that was of relevance, and the overall marker was that people with chronic illness or disability on average have poorer mental health to start with.
In the first place.
But in the actual rise, so it didn't go from here to here, it went from there to there.
Yes.
There was a lesser rise on the higher baseline.
Now, Professor, because you've done something visually with your hands, I'm going to try and attempt to describe what it is you did, but I might not. I might just ask you to. Could you just explain what you just did with your hands in terms of the effect?
Yes, so if you have the general population going from this level to this level, that's a baseline.
Yes.
But your people with disability or long-standing illness might have started there and
closer
gone to
the top line. Yes.
So the rise has been less.
Yeah.
The difference is less.
Yeah, I think everyone understands. Just attempting for the stenographer to try and sum that up. But the important point is that you might look at a statistic like that in a report and misread it to say that disabled individuals weren't that affected. That's not the case. They were already very affected by mental health, mental distress, and so the point at 3.2.12 isn't to be read like that.
And also that those individuals where the general population's health came down quite significantly when the restrictions were eased, this group didn't drop so much.
Yes.
So
I see. So they stayed at a higher level.
It's complex to put an overall.
Again, it's been very helpful to ask about this particular part of the review, and what you've explained is that you're looking at a lot of studies. It may not be that the study is particularly signposted as being about disabled people, but you have managed to find something that you think's worth footnoting or referring to, and that's the next question, in fact. Footnote 289 covers sex and ethnicity or adults over the age of 50 on the face of it, and that is got from the description of the studies, 86, 20 and 16. I won't take you to the detailed description, but indeed it does seem to describe sex and ethnicity. The first paper refers to COVID-19 as an at-risk group as opposed to something specific on disabled people. That's the second one. And finally, something about loneliness, physical activity and mental health. Again, it's a geriatric paper. So the points being made is, you know, are these studies that are footnoted there actually focused on disabled people?
They have comments or issues that they're reporting which are relevant to that group, but that wasn't their main purpose when they set out.
And did they disaggregate for disability? It sounds not from what you're saying. You're just saying that they were mentioned.
We've been able to pull up a couple of the papers and have a look. I mean, I would need to spend a little time working out exactly, but certainly one of them had this little nugget about people with disabilities and chronic illness towards the end, which was very specific to them.
Thank you. I'm going to leave that section of the report now, whilst again thanking you for the detailed consideration against all of those groups in society. It's really important to look at that with that level of detail. Can I now take you to the concluding sections of the review? Again, the reference is INQ 000659 787, and if we could go to page 63. These are your concluding reflections. Again, we can all read it, but could you, as the senior academic consultant, sort of sum it up for us? Where did you get to in terms of the patterns and the reflections, having looked at all of that evidence?
Well, there's a couple of patterns that were really robust and strong that we haven't actually touched on yet. And these were where there's very large groups of the population. So with both age and gender, there were really important findings within the most robust studies. And particularly with age, there was a clear evidence that the younger age groups, the younger adults whose mental health started a bit poorer, the rise in mental health problems amongst that group was really importantly more than in the other age groups, and that actually across the population it was the elderly whose mental health deteriorated less during the pandemic. And that's particularly important because the young were those who were least at risk from the virus and whose mental health seems to have been impacted more adversely and has not come back to the level where it was before. So this is, I think this is one of the really key things that came out of this report. And the other thing was the impact on women, where again we've got a disparity in the starting point in that women's mental health is less good, but the effect on women was clearly very dramatically more so than on men in terms of the reporting of their mental health. And whilst you can still see the same patterns of easing with when the restrictions came off and then getting worse when they went on again, this is a finding of an extremely robust and very important finding.
Thank you. And could we just go to the next page, if possible? Yes, just there. It's going back to recovery, and we've touched on this when we were looking at the broad periods earlier on, and also protective factors as well. So if I could just ask you to just take us through those 2 points, which are in bold on the screen there.
Yes. So the obviously the socioeconomic risk factors were a big thing that we focused on and looked to find data on. And there was an interesting paradoxical finding in the first lockdown that it seemed to be the people with the highest levels of education and the greatest wealth whose mental health was impacted more, which was very much a surprise finding, was because we'd expect the reverse. But that didn't carry on we found the classic things that we might have looked for, like people who lost their jobs or were suffering financial insecurity during the pandemic. Their mental health was affected more. But there's a couple of things that came out of this, particularly maybe with his occupational group rather than socioeconomic factors, but maybe we can deal with it here in terms of working conditions and what was going on, was initially, again, people who were in employment, and particularly people who were working from home at the beginning, their mental health was protected to begin with. But that didn't carry on as the pandemic went through, and it became home working then became more of an issue and did reduce people's levels of mental health. Otherwise, people who started off the pandemic unemployed or with high levels of poverty, a bit like we've already spoken of with other groups, their mental distress started high and it didn't go up as much. But so the increase wasn't as great as with other population groups. But that was because of the high level, and then there was less recovery amongst that group. So there's some important detail here. I think the data on ethnic minority groups was also really, it was one we looked at in some detail, and the studies weren't very clear, but the suggestion was that both men and women of black and ethnic minority groups' mental health dropped to the same level as white women. So the white men seemed to fare better. So there was evidence that wasn't black and ethnic minority communities were affected disproportionately.
Thank you. Professor, I will be moving towards some closing parts of your report now. I'm just conscious, again, huge coverage of many points. Again, as we get to the end of this section, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to before I move on to things such as data gaps and other conclusions?
Clearly, furloughing did protect people against the drop in mental health problems, so that was a good thing. Interestingly, people who were in unions, their mental health fared better. So we haven't really talked about the protective factors. And there, another interesting finding was, and particularly in terms of Sarah Hughes's evidence, previously Dr. Hughes's evidence,
yes,
that there was a physical activity effect. So we know that physical activity is protective of mental health. But what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, it seemed that people who relied on physical activity to maintain their good mental health, their mental health was severely affected because they couldn't go to their gyms anymore. And possibly more so because that was their main protective factor, that they weren't using other methods. And the other clear protective factor that came out was to do with access to green spaces. So urban populations tended to fare worse than rural ones. But in London, people who had access to green spaces, for example, fared better than those who didn't. So people who were able to get out of their houses and go for a walk in nature had less severe deterioration. So those were important protective factors that we identified.
Thank you, Professor. I think you've covered there all of the key highlighted issues in that section of the concluding remarks. Again, if there's anything else that you think is worthy of a bit more attention, please just say we have the time to hear you on anything else that hasn't been covered.
Were we going to be looking at gaps?
Yes, that's
Okay.
next. Yeah,
Yes.
well, that's good.
The other thing, which is all tied up with many of the things we talked about, but people who, loneliness was a big thing that came out in many of the reports, and loneliness is an important predictor of mental health problems. And so the corollary of that was that people who had access to social connectedness and social support of some sort were protected.
Thank you. Ultimately, that statistic, looking at multiple lockdowns and the pandemic as an experience as a whole, what you've provided is this statistic of 40% of people kept feeling high levels of stress or distress across several lockdowns. And I take it that you feel that conclusion is pretty robust.
Absolutely. And certainly, 50% of people at some stage dipped into what we might call a clinical level of mental health problems.
Thank you. I would now like to, before we do get to data gaps, just look at a conclusion that you've reached at page 68. So same INQ reference, but page 68. And drawing it all together, whether or not all of these impacts that you've described were actually caused by the pandemic. And what you've said there is that most of the studies reviewed clearly cannot provide a direct cause and effect, but they show associations between the pandemic and these changes. It's not absolute proof. But then you go on to essentially conclude that it's very likely that the pandemic played a major role, and you've given these three features there. Could I ask you just to explain those to us? Timing, consistency, exposure and impact.
Yes, epidemiologists are very often focused with this issue because they'll observe an association between one thing and another thing, and did one cause the other? And so a lot of effort has gone in this discipline to saying, so what are the factors that we might consider which would really end up with us believing that A does cause B? And they're not a single thing, they are a cumulative number of things, and when you get to the end of the list you're 100% sure, but when you're halfway through the list you might be 70% sure, for example. And so one of the key thing is that all these studies looked at mental health at one point in time, and then they looked at mental health at another point in time, and related that to what was going on in the pandemic at that time. So you're seeing shifts in mental health which are related to what was going on in terms of the virus, the lockdowns and the vaccines. So that's an important, that the trajectories follow each other.
Yes.
The other thing is that and this is where the systematic reviews come in as really important, if you get the same findings or similar findings in a lot of different studies, you're going to go, this is something that is really robust and that we need to take into account. And then the other thing that these studies gave us was that the greater, if you've got the greater exposure to whatever you're considering to be the risk, like the pandemic or the lockdown effects, the greater effect on the outcomes. So these are pretty strong evidence. And whilst other factors may well have come in and played a part, and they may have part disproportionately in different populations, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind, having looked at all this data, that the pandemic had a profound, and I think not really anticipated, effect on the mental health of the population in the UK that has not gone back to where it was before. So we've seen a resetting of the population's health at a level which is very detrimental to lots of things that we might care a lot about.
Thank you so much, Professor. Can I ask you now then to, let's go to page 73, same INQ reference, and this is this issue of gaps. So you've looked at all of these studies. and you've noted some key gaps. And when we go to individual groups, you'll see the odd use of the red traffic light or amber to try and investigate and get what you described as nuggets of information about groups. And I'm not going to ask you about the ones that you've listed. What I'm going to ask you about is some others that others in the room today have asked me to clarify with you, whether or not there's more to say about that. But the list that you've given there, just taking it in turn: ethnic minorities, sexual and gender minorities, caregivers, individuals with pre-existing conditions, specific occupational groups, survivors of gender-based violence and abuse, parents, especially single parents, pregnant women and maternity, and I think finally, older adults, individuals with long COVID, individuals in specific settings which are set out there, and finally, clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable groups. So you've set out there specific population groups where you felt that there's just a lack of data in the various ways described.
Yes, I just to add to that, it would have been wonderful to have found studies relevant to these populations, but we can't go back and get that data, so no further research can tell what happened to those particular populations in the pandemic. And I also think there is a lack of realism in thinking that we could have had this data, because the sort of studies that were done and these big population surveys rely on people having addresses, having internet addresses, and being able to complete forms themselves, complete questionnaires themselves. And you cannot, for example, get good data from people who are homeless in that sort of methodology. You have to have a completely different, much, much more expensive methodology where people go and sit with and find people in the parks who are homeless and have conversations with them and help them fill in these forms. And the same is true of a lot of these marginalised groups, is that you don't expect to find great things in research terms from those populations in these sort of large-scale population studies. You have to do something special to find those.
Thank you. So leading on then, we had some earlier questions about the section on disabled people. I'm asked to clarify with you, do you consider there's a significant data gap in relation to disabled people specifically?
Well, in these terms, yes, I do, but I don't know that more could have been done.
Yes, I mean, we're not going to focus on. Well, we may ask you some questions about why there are these gaps later, but in relation to disabled people, there is a gap, and would you agree there's a need for disaggregated data on disabled people?
Yes, it would be very good to have that.
Also asked to clarify or ask you to consider whether there's a data gap and whether there are dedicated studies needed on the mental health and well-being of clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable people. So they are there at the end of the list that we've got up on screen, but I think the question is, do you consider there should be dedicated studies? Because you've mentioned that elsewhere.
I think one of the issues is the definition of clinically vulnerable it changes and did change during the pandemic. So initially that term was used to describe people who were on chemotherapy or who had illnesses that compromised their immune systems. It was a very limited definition and they were advised to shield, and that was a good thing for them to do. But actually people with severe mental illness were a clinically vulnerable population because their immune systems were compromised. And shielding, they weren't part of that definition to begin with.
We've heard that this morning,
shielding would have really not been a good idea, because that would have been further damaging their mental health and then their infection risk. So I think this whole idea of what is a clinically vulnerable population is one that's not really been possible to tease out much in this review. And clearly is important. But what this review has done is highlighted that when we're talking about that the clinically vulnerable was only thought about as, are you at risk of this virus? There were a lot of people in this population who were clinically vulnerable to severe mental health problems. And that was not considered in the definition and thought wasn't given to how we optimise pandemic control measures to support that group in a way that doesn't really severely impact on their mental health.
Thank you. Is there a gap in the evidence relating to people in prison and immigration removal centres?
Yes, but once again, immigration, it was not simple to get data, and particularly on immigrants, many of whom's first language is not English. You need a different type of study, and you need a different type of study to engage the prison population in something like this, who are, a disaffected group.
Yes, and I think some of these questions that I'm coming to are dealing more with the issues that we're touching on. What are the barriers that have led to the underrepresentation of these groups, and how could they be addressed?
Well, I think we've just covered them.
Indeed, yes.
And how can they be addressed? We did need this data on population level data, and no other approach would have given us the information that we've been able to present today, which is what we were asked to do, that this pandemic had a huge effect on the general population's mental health. Those studies are valuable and necessary, but it is also important to consider more vulnerable populations and what happened with them. But my sense is this inquiry has actually covered those groups quite well through qualitative descriptions and through groups who are in touch with those groups, and has brought the mental health impact on those groups into the inquiry, and tends to be all the rest are okay, and they weren't.
Thank you. I do, I'm afraid, have just quite a few more questions of a similar vein, so if you can just bear with me, we'll probably take it. It's very fair to ask if a particular group has or hasn't been covered, even though it's maybe not mentioned. So one thing that you have said in the review is you mentioned long-term studies with pre-pandemic data to enable comparisons, and also about international comparison. This is in order to understand the impact.
That's on the research.
Yeah, it's later on.
It'd be great if I could have them up.
Well, I tell you what, we'll come back to that,
okay,
because that'll
right,
be the
okay.
last slide. So we'll come back to that. That's kind of recommendations for specific sorts of research, and you're going to be asked about whether or not there are any barriers to that happening. So I'll come back to those two questions. A more specific one, was there any evidence that access to public services was a critical determinant of overall mental well-being? And if not, do you consider further research would be beneficial in that area?
I think the research did not give us that information. It would be astonishing if it wasn't important, but I can't say anything on the basis of the data we looked at.
Just three more questions, I think, on this, on the data gaps. You were asked, you were asked about the data gaps being in relation to groups that appear to be vulnerable. So what's been pointed out is that during the course of the review, you've identified various vulnerable groups, and it's the self-same groups in many cases where we don't have the data. What's the consequence for understanding the full scale and the distribution of mental health harms during the pandemic of that?
Doesn't that take us back to the answer you gave just now, that we've gathered the evidence in other ways?
Yes.
The qualitative evidence and the evidence from representative groups?
Yes, and it's quite hard to weight qualitative evidence against quantitative, putting those two together. But there is no other way of getting at this, I think.
Okay. Yes, I can probably take these three last questions together. They are, one, were the vulnerabilities understood before the pandemic? Do you understand why the gaps exist? And finally, do the gaps hinder planning for these same groups and mitigating harms for any future pandemic or civil emergency?
So I think from what I said, I understand the gaps.
Yes.
They're very understandable and I think probably unavoidable
Yes.
in these contexts. But it just means that you don't rely on a systematic review like this to consider all the possible harms. You have other mechanisms, such as you've put in place.
Thank you. Can I get then finally the slide that has your recommendations? And these are recommendations about the types of research, and you may have some points of your own, but the two remaining questions were about the use or the need for long-term studies with pre-pandemic data to enable comparisons and also international comparisons. And you're being asked, are there any barriers to such studies being prepared?
Yes, so I think of these ones which are actually quite easy to put into place. The longer-term trend is really, really important. The last data point was 2023. We're now in 2026. Has this dropped? Has our population mental health gone back to where it was pre-pandemic, or is the trend in that direction, or is it stable, or is it continuing to go on? And we need that to understand the impact of the pandemic, because that resetting of the level of mental health has implications for all sorts of aspects of human functioning in the future. Not least health service usage, but also chronic illness and productivity, sickness, all those kind of things. So a reduction in mental well-being of 1 point has a measurable effect on health service usage for physical health problems in the years to come.
I'm sorry, I interrupt you. Carry on. You finish your thought.
That was the end of that thought.
Right.
I've got another one, but we can stop.
Can I just keep that thought in your head, the second thought? Can I go back to, you said that mental health problems, how are we going to call them, they were on the rise before the pandemic.
Yes.
And you said that the levels have not returned to pre-pandemic levels.
Yes.
Let's take the pandemic out of the equation.
Yes.
If they were on the rise before,
I get
wouldn't
your
you have
point.
expected to see?
Yes. Yeah, they would have gone on rising, but the trajectory is completely different.
That's the key.
Yep.
Yep.
And we're not at a point now where you would have expected the trends, the gradual trends, to end up.
Right.
So we're not there. Yeah.
Okay, your
That's
second
good.
thought now.
I might need to go back. What was we need to just? Yes. So
sorry.
that's. I think that's the end of the. We must carry on looking at population mental health in this way, and to particularly look at age and gender, the big groups that you really can tell something about. So those studies must be commissioned. I imagine they will be being commissioned, but there may be a tendency to sort of forget about it. Everybody, all the academics were rushing into COVID when it happened and doing studies that contributed to their credibility and value. And now it's gone away. There's a possibility that we'll sort of forget what happened. So I think it is important that's remembered.
Well, Professor, you and your team made a massive contribution to recording what happened. Thank you very much for all of that work, to the whole of your team, and also for explaining it to us so engagingly today.
There was just the one more point from this, which was about not about the trends, but that there is a little bit of evidence in this that there were two things. There was the virus, which was terrifying and had huge impacts, and there was the control measures. Different countries had different levels of control measures, and we know those different levels of control measures had an impact on the virus and its spread. We could commission studies that looked at different approaches to control measures and the mental health studies that were done in those populations, and make a comparison with mental health as an outcome on a par with all the illness and disability that went on with COVID, most of which people have recovered from. So I think that's a very doable study that could be put in place, but probably would need to be commissioned.
Thank you very much. There may be some more questions for you.
There are. And it's Mr. Weatherby to start, who sits just there.
Thank you very much. Professor, I represent the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And I have just one point, and it's about data gap, I'm afraid. You've given a lot of evidence about that, but this is a specific point about bereavement, so I think it may be slightly different. At page 13 of the report or the study, you refer to data availability as a limitation on your findings, and noting in particular, and I quote, that although data extraction on bereavement using validated grief measures was attempted, none of the included studies reported bereavement outcomes. Consequently, no quantitative analysis was possible for this domain. Now, my questions, are you first of all able to help us as to why there is this data set deficit with respect to that? And having noted the lack of available research data on bereavement and mental health outcomes, is this an area where further research is required both now and in a future emergency?
I think there is a room for a lot more research on bereavement and its impact, and I think particularly I've referred to good death and a bad death, and what went on in the pandemic could not be described as a good death under any circumstances, and the effect that those have on the mental health of the bereaved ongoing. But I don't know that that needs to be linked to a pandemic, and I think it's unlikely to be able to be. You have to prioritise what is going on in terms of research in the context of a pandemic where everybody's frantically trying to do things. And I think those questions could be answered outside a pandemic and possibly a little more reflectively.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Wagner. Mr. Wagner sits at the back there.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Professor. I act for clinically vulnerable families.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
A bit better.
Okay, I'll speak close to the microphone. I act for clinically vulnerable families. I want to ask you about the definition of clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable, which you have referred to in your evidence. And you say in the report that evidence on clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable groups was hampered by inconsistent definitions and classifications across studies. And you've also said that in many studies, the CV-CEV group was defined using, CV or CEV group was defined using the government's official shielding list, while others included individuals with chronic conditions or self-reported vulnerability more broadly. First question on this is, would it be easier to conduct the dedicated study that you have recommended if there was a consistent measure of clinical vulnerability?
Yes, but I think we're unlikely to get it just like that, because it depends what factors you're considering in that definition. And the point that I've made is that having a severe mental illness makes you clinically vulnerable. But I don't think it's in any of the definitions that people are thinking about, because they are thinking about particular physical health problems. So I think there's a much longer conversation to be had before we could get to that point.
No, I suppose you're answering a slightly different question about what that category would include, and of course that would be a longer conversation. But do you see in principle the value of attempting to find some sort of category where you could include clinical vulnerability, because it has an analytical benefit for mental health, for studying people's mental health?
Yes, I'm sure it would be valuable.
Yeah. And do you think it would assist in that respect also if clinical vulnerability to disease in general was recognised as a distinct characteristic or a population group?
I think the danger there would be turning something that's a spectrum or a continuum into a dichotomy or a binary thing, because we've all got varying levels of susceptibility or vulnerability to illness. And it's not you couldn't ever make a cut point that says you're vulnerable and you're not. So I don't know that what you're looking for could be achieved. I think there will always be different cut points that are necessary to include in the studies.
But doesn't that apply to lots of vulnerabilities that an individual may fluctuate from one to the on a spectrum? But we do look at, for example, disability as an overall category, even though individuals might fluctuate and conditions may be less or more of a disability in general. But do you see? But there is a value in looking at that generally.
But the studies with different definitions have a contribution to make.
Yeah.
I think what I'd say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Ms. Moffat, who I think is over there.
Good afternoon, Professor.
I'm challenged on the hearing.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's much
I
better.
represent the MRC, a group of 9 organisations who represents the rights and interests of migrant people. You may have in part answered my question when you spoke about people in immigration detention. It relates again to data gaps. You cover immigration status on page 63 of your report. I don't propose that you turn it up. But in summary, what you say is that there's very limited evidence directly on immigration status and that most studies either do not mention it or say that results for this population group were not reported or analysed. And so my simple question is, do you consider that the lack of research on migrants' mental health during the pandemic may be explained by insufficient or inadequate data collection on this population? Was this, in effect, an additional data gap?
Yes, it is a data gap, but I think I have answered the question in that what were the priorities for this research, and that doesn't mean to say the health of migrants is not incredibly important, but it was the focus of the research was on the general population.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Ms. Davis, who's that way.
Can you see and hear me, Professor?
I can. Thank you.
And I think I'm your last set of questions. You'll be pleased. You'll be pleased to hear.
One more.
One more. So I apologise. I'm asking questions on behalf of the Domestic Abuse Group. I'm asking questions on behalf of the Domestic Abuse Group, which is 3 organisations from the violence against women and girls sector. And you've just been asked about the data gap in relation to immigration status, which you deal with in your report at page 62. And immediately preceding that, another group of people for whom there's a data gap is survivors of gender-based violence. And I want to ask you about the intersection between those two. Because there is a certain amount of evidence. We've provided accounts in the statement from the Domestic Abuse Group's statement, which I think you've been asked to read some of. There's also a comment in the expert witness evidence from Dr. Wenham, who's the expert to this inquiry on gender. And indeed, there have been reports from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner and so forth to the effect that migrant women with insecure immigration status, those with no recourse to public funds, are especially vulnerable, often lacking access to public funds, excluded from what was the destitution domestic violence concession, fearing enforcement if they seek help, and specifically help with domestic abuse. And therefore, women in that situation with insecure immigration status and subject to domestic abuse face compounded mental health challenges. So on that, first of all, are you able to say that corroborates some of the research that is available? And secondly, do you agree that there is a data gap into this issue of immigration status and domestic abuse that warrants further research?
I would not in any way question your fundamental premise, but the review wasn't able to offer any additional information on that because of the various factors that we've talked about already. I'm sure this would be a valuable research endeavour. It's quite a difficult one because gender-based violence offers a lot of shame and people don't come forward to talk about it a lot. So, and particularly with the migrant population, it's a very needs to be a very thought-out, reflective piece of work as to how you would find the truth in that population. And that's not compatible with the sort of types of research that can contribute to the main question we were answering in this part of the inquiry.
Thank you. And that leads me on to moving away from the connection with immigration abuse and more broadly domestic abuse, survivors of gender-based violence. You say that whilst domestic and sexual violence are recognised as major factors affecting mental health, the large UK studies reviewed did not collect direct data from survivors. And so you put up an exclamation mark and you say that the conclusions need to be treated with caution. I wonder if we could have the Domestic Abuse Group statement INQ 000652-188 at page 78, please, up on the screen, and specifically paragraph 272. And paragraph 272, which contains a case study in the name of Tracy. All our names are anonymised, and she sets out, she was a client of Solace Women's Aid. She came to a refuge after fleeing from her ex-husband. On arriving, she was very emotional and distressed, struggled to maintain focus due to high anxiety levels. It later emerged that she was experiencing her first psychotic episode and was supported to attend hospital to be seen by the crisis team. So that comes from Solace Women's Aid. Is that the sort of direct evidence and testimony that researchers would need in order to corroborate the interpret with caution findings?
Well, I think this sort of case study approach and the qualitative interviews make a really valuable contribution. You need both methods to try and get to truth in this.
Thank you. And my final question, in your opinion, does the violence against women and girls sector that consists of Women's Aid, Refuge, a number of what's called by and for organisations and so forth, would they have an important role to play in helping bridge those evidence gaps and producing some efficient methods in order to collect and gather that type of qualitative, I'm so sorry, I get my quantitative and qualitative mixed up, qualitative evidence from victim survivors? Would the sector help?
I can't imagine trying to embark on a study like that without the sector's help.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Ms Davis. And Mr Pisani, who's behind you. But don't worry, if you speak into the microphone, he's used to people's backs, aren't you, Mr Pisani?
I am, my lady.
I turn when I'm hearing him.
Also, there's no need to turn around because my question has been asked and answered already.
All right.
So I'm grateful.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that completes the questions we have for you, Professor. Thank you so much for your help and the help of your team. I really don't envy the task you all had. I hope you had a really supportive and excellent team around you.
Yeah.
It's been extremely helpful. And there's sometimes a temptation for those of us who don't understand more about these studies to say, well, that report says X. And it's only when you find out the caveats from an expert like you that you can put that report into context. So I'm extremely grateful to you and your team.
Thank you.
Please convey my thanks to them as well. Very well, I shall return at 1:55.